Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, The Ethics of Sharing Great Lakes Water. I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of For Love of Water, a Great Lakes Water Law and Policy Center based here in Traverse City, Michigan. I'd like to begin our event by sharing a water and land acknowledgement. For Love of Water is located on lands historically occupied by the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the sacred lands and waters of all Indigenous people, and their continued presence. I am thrilled to present this webinar sponsored by the Barton J. Ingram and Gail G. Ingram Foundation. I'd like to share just a couple of words about flow. Our mission is to ensure that the waters of the Great Lakes Basin are healthy, public, and protected for all. With a staff of legal and policy experts, authors, and community builders, Flow is a trusted resource for Great Lakes advocates. We help communities, businesses, agencies, and legislators make informed policy decisions and protect public trust rights to water. Now I'd like to introduce today's host and moderator, Dave Dempsey, Flow's Senior Policy Advisor. And in addition to him being a prolific author himself, Dave has over 35 years of experience in environmental policy. He's served as an environmental advisor to former Governor James Blanchard and as policy advisor on the staff of the International Joint Commission, established under the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty between the U.S. and Canada. And now I will turn the program over to Dave and encourage our audience to submit questions in the Q&A during the program, as we will take audience questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody to our webinar. I'm really excited to have this chance to moderate, but also listen to a fruitful discussion from experts on the global issues of water and also how those issues will apply to the Great Lakes in decades to come. I wanted to let you all know that today we'll be releasing a report that you'll be able to find on our website called Watershed Moment, the Great Lakes Compact After 15 Years. This is an attempt to analyze how the compact has worked and where some improvements could be made in implementation of the compact. Let's look at the perspective of the compact first. This is a good map showing the watersheds of the 5 Great Lakes as we know them, ranging from Lake Superior to Lake Ontario. I've always pointed out in my presentations, especially in Michigan, how different jurisdictions have different interests in the Great Lakes based on the amount of the watershed that they contain. And we can talk more about that later. Okay, so we're going to talk today, especially toward the end, about the Great Lakes Compact and how it may reflect some of the issues we'll be discussing in terms of global water. The compact, as most of you know, was signed and ratified in 2008 and includes the 8 Great Lakes states with congressional approval and a signature from President Bush. Canadian provinces of Quebec and Ontario are not members of the compact, but they are co-signers with the 8 Great Lakes states of a parallel agreement that is, in essence, contains the same commitments. There's a growing issue that we're talking about and in the Great Lakes and elsewhere around the world, and that is the human right to water. I wanted to ask each of the panelists to discuss if they believe there's a human right to water, and if so, how could that be enforced? Let's begin with Caitlin, please.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction and glad to be here with everyone. So in 2010, the United Nations declared access to water and sanitation a human right. But 14 years later, right, this remains far from realized, not just globally, but here in the United States. I think water is so fundamental, we often forget how fundamental it is and that we can't live for more than a few days without it. And so we often don't think about or talk about how access to clean piped water isn't a given. Even in the United States, there's over 1 million people who don't have piped water. And Flint, Michigan is one of many, right? An example of a growing number of cases where when you turn on the tap, there may not be clean water. And I think that the language of rights, the human right to water included, can elicit a lot of different terms, ideas, definitions. But I think what it does is it articulates a really succinct alternative to the language of profits. And what I see is that a lot of social movements, campaigns, organizations fighting for access to clean water do use this language of the human right to water. And I think, I am convinced that this concept of human rights and concept of human right to water is important, but I think I'm increasingly less convinced of the idea that we can use institutions to implement or enforce human rights, right? I think that organized people power, communities organizing and coming together, linking struggles across geographic space, and using direct action and other means to target decision makers is really critical to change. I'm not saying we shouldn't use the legal system or that the legal system doesn't play a role, but there is research on environmental justice more broadly by Laura Polito in particular that's showing kind of success rates around different environmental justice issues, again, not specific to water, but that through legislative means or even EPA enforcement, that those success rates are unfortunately not that high. And I think this thinking about even using the term enforcement kind of points to how, as a society, we are kind of very much, we think about things in punitive terms, right? Whether we're talking about our so-called criminal justice system or environmental or water issues. And so I think there is a human right to water. And I do think that making laws harder for corporations to be able to pollute and extract or taxing them when they do, that is important. But it's also part of a kind of a larger struggle to reimagine our kind of relationships with each other and even the planet. But I will say as well that I think we have to be cautious of human rights language as well, because we see some of the world's largest water privatization firms using the human right to water in their rhetoric, but inherently their interest is not in providing every human the right to water, right? It's to make profit off water. And at the same time, I see that, my work in and with social movements from the United States to Brazil to Nigeria, that people on the ground doing this work are using the phrase the right to water. And so I think it is very important and critical for that reason, because I think we all kind of have a sense of what that means, right? That it means people, we die without this, so we have access to it. And that it's a very succinct way to say water shouldn't be a commodity, right? It shouldn't be something that's just for financial gain. And so for now, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I wanted to interject something that I should have said before, but this whole discussion is about how the Great Lakes Compact could be affected by global issues. And the reason that it might be affected is that the compact essentially bans water diversions with some limited exceptions. But one of the bigger exceptions potentially is what's called a humanitarian exception, which would allow water to be diverted or taken out of the watershed in the case of a, quote, short-term humanitarian emergency. So we want to put the rights discussion in the context of how the compact could be affected. Let's go on now to Susan, please.
Yeah, hi, Anin, bonjour. Su Chiblow Dishnakas, Ogama Nag Indigo, Chachak Dodam, Ketaganzi being Danjaba, Ketaganzi being in Dogam, Anishinaabe, Aki, and Dao. So my English name is Su Chiblow. I'm from Garden River. I want to thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to this panel. I'm grateful to be here. When I think about the human rights to water, my first thought was, why do we even have a human right to water? What have we done as humans to create this crisis? Prior to industrialization, we all had water. We used to be able to put a dipper in the lake and drink from the water. Now we can't do that. And I also think about, from an Anishinaabe perspective, when we talk about right, that word can't even be said in our language. So I think about the responsibilities that we have to the waters, but also those responsibilities that the waters have to all life. And I think Caitlin mentioned that, without, we cannot survive without water, but water could certainly survive without us. And so thinking about, from an Anishinaabe perspective, we are part of that water cycle. We, as humans, we're part of that water cycle. We're not above it. We're not outside of it. We're part of it. And that connects us to place. It connects us to the lands. It connects us to all the beings that live in that area. So I think that responsibility needs to be extended, because as Anishinaabe people, we are the babies of creation. We are the last ones to be here. And so when we understand that and start to actually live that, we don't interfere with the other responsibilities that the waters have. And that responsibility is water providing life, but to also remember that that water has duality, that it can also take life. And so the human right to water really, it's just a terminology because, you know, even thinking about that, it doesn't sit inside the Indigenous worldview or the Anishinaabe worldview. And when we look across the world, the ones that are primarily affected by lack of clean access to clean drinking water are Indigenous peoples and Black peoples. And so even understanding what our worldviews are compared to what's being put upon us, even through the Great Lakes Compact, because when that was negotiated and signed, there were no Indigenous peoples at the table. And so I really try to promote that we need that Indigenous worldview at the table. We need to understand it and to actually start to live it. Now, thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sue. Cameron?
Thanks, Dave, Liz, for having me and for being on this panel with Dr. Schroering and Dr. Chiblow. So going back to some of the things that Dr. Chiblow and Dr. Schroering said, totally agree that we have to be very skeptical of the human right to water. I think the human right to water can be a fuel for activist organizations. It might be able to galvanize groups and move them towards a more common ownership form of model of water ownership or distribution. But in my research and in my own work, I want to point to the human right to water not only being a matter of distribution, like water justice issues not only being a matter of distribution, but they're also deeply political issues. And I'm specifically focused on democracy, especially deliberative democracy. And how might the human right to water, yes, bring groups together, bring people together, but to specifically have people talk about the issue? How can we promote autonomy of communities around water as this linchpin of discussion and really of democracy itself? But human rights to water don't preclude privatization. They don't preclude environmental domination or domination of other people. We have to be vigilant against corporate interests that might dilute the power of what the human right to water might mean or what human rights may mean. And as Dr. Chiblow said, we have to really reflect on why we need to make explicit these rights at all. How have we formed our socioeconomic systems to, in this way, like we need a right to water, this necessity for life? Why do we even have to be so explicit about something that should be anodyne? But it's really not. And yes, the UN has declared the human right to water in 2010, but I think back to what the UN Special Rapporteur on Water, Sanitation, and Health, Pedro Arojo Agudo, said about last year's huge UN water conference. This was the largest UN water conference in 40, 50 years. And he said that the conference lacked a human rights lens. It doesn't appear on the outcomes document of the conference, and it wasn't in the quote unquote game changers. That is to say, although institutions have recognized it, recognition doesn't mean inaction. It doesn't mean it's being taken up. So just to put a bow on it, great that we can recognize the human right to water, but we must look at it with skepticism. And instead, how might we be able to restructure our water governance models?
Thanks, Cameron. I wanted to talk a little bit more about rights. There's a growing rights of nature movement, as I'm sure you're aware. Voters in Toledo, Ohio approved a Lake Erie Bill of Rights a couple of years ago, which was later struck down by the courts. This Bill of Rights established, quote, irrevocable rights for the Lake Erie ecosystem to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve, a right to a healthy environment for the citizens of Toledo, and which elevates the rights of the community and its natural environment over powers claimed by certain corporations. Do you agree with this framework? And if so, does the human right to water and the rights of nature ever come in conflict? Let's start this time again with Caitlin.
All right, great. Thanks for the question. So I think I actually want to also just note, I agree with really everything that both of my co-panelists said. And I do think that a lot of are thinking about, right, dismantling some of this very human-centric or anthropocentric notion, right, of rights. It's not a concept that exists across time and space. But I want to just give a little bit of background, I think, that speaks directly to the question you just asked. So there is precedence in other countries, right, in enshrining the rights of nature into their constitution. So specifically in Ecuador in 2008, and then 2009 in Bolivia, and then in Bolivia, two later laws in 2010 and 2012 that specifically talked about like rights of nature. The Constitution is more just the importance of protecting nature. And we can see examples in, in New Zealand, right, where a river was given rights. I think in the United States, actually, in general, though, we struggle for all the flaws with it as well, but we struggle with the concept of even human rights. And in part, I think it's because the Constitution, which is very old and very, I will say, maybe it's controversial, but colonial document, but it's very focused on what get called first generation rights, right? So the right for the state that you have a right to do something, that you have freedom of speech, for example. We talk less about, and the Constitution doesn't talk about, right, second generation. So that would be, for example, that the state has to provide education, for example. That's a second generation, right? And then by the time we get to collective rights, we could think of, these as being third generation rights or more collective. So the right to peace or to protect the environment. And so I think when we're talking about the rights of nature, that becomes almost more of like a fourth generation right. And I'm not a legal scholar, but I share this because I think it is maybe important kind of background to situate it. So I think it's also interesting in the example, even when people voted for this, that the court said no, because our legal system struggles to wrap its head around the idea of rights as collective and not individual. And I think it's hard, not just in the legal system, right, but in our society. I think the critique also, right, that rights language can be very legalistic, very Western, very top down. And it is all those things. And increasingly, I find myself moving a bit away from it, at least with not giving qualifications. But at the same time, right, we see movements, we see people using this language because it is somewhat simple and we can wrap our heads around it. We all have an idea of what it means. I don't necessarily think that the human right to water and the rights of nature need to be in conflict. There isn't really enough time to get into all of this, but I think that if we're actually going to enshrine the human right to water, we have to have some serious reorganization of our social and economic systems, and also break down this binary thinking that's not been shared across history or cultures, that people and environment are separate, right? Because we aren't. The same corporation that's depleting or polluting a river is often the same one, right, that's not treating workers well or exposing them to toxins. And so I think that thinking about the rights of nature also has to include the human in that. We are a part of nature. We're not separate from it. And so I think that this actually trying to think about things in that sense can in some ways challenge this individualistic, legalistic, colonial Western notion of the terminology, and also maybe move it beyond something other than rights, to include, right, just that all life is connected and we have to think about how we protect each other and all of it together. And for sake of time, I'll end it there.
Thanks, Caitlin. Sue, would you like to answer next, please?
Yes, thank you. Great responses, Caitlin. I really appreciate the responses that you just provided specifically to this question, and also to Cameron, how you had mentioned the socioeconomic structures that we've created as humans, and these prioritize economic growth. So we're embedded in a system that is very difficult to maneuver to actually give those responsibilities back to nature, those responsibilities back to human. And as Caitlin had mentioned, we are a part of nature. And a lot of the old people or the elders that I work with always remind me that what we do to the waters, what we do to the lands, we are actually doing to ourselves. Because when we look at our physical, chemical makeup, we're actually made up of the lands. And a lot of these, I wouldn't call them concepts, but a lot of these teachings, these understandings are embedded in Anishinaabe. We have our own laws, and we call it Knocknagawin, and that doesn't literally translate into law. There's a bigger meaning in it, but understanding what Anishinaabe laws are in relation to our responsibilities to live in balance and harmony with nature, and how do we change a system that is so embedded in economic growth, so embedded with privatization, ownership, and it supports corporations. Corporations, unfortunately, have been given rights, and we're giving a right that can trump any other right, including human rights. So I think that, you know, we really need to step back and take a look at these systems that we've created, and how do we begin to educate and create systems that are more equitable to not just humans, but to all life, and allowing that balance and harmony of life to be able to provide responsibilities. Because the elders also say that when we talk about the lands, and when I use that term, the lands, I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about all the beings on the lands, the waters, the beings in the waters, and also too about the sky world, and thinking about that responsibility. When the elders talk about that, they say, you know, the lands are our pharmacy, the lands are our education system, the lands are our kitchen. The lands are our home, and we would never walk into somebody else's home and just start pouring contaminants down, you know, on their floor, kind of thing. So I think that there are a lot of great opportunities to start to educate people, because people really enjoy green spaces. People really enjoy being near the water. And so what are people's water stories, and what is that connection that they have, and talking about that connection, and that evolves into the protection, the responsibility of restoring, you know, because the Great Lakes Compact is also part of that bigger Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and then the treaty, the international agreements that are in place. And a lot of it is about restoration, and that is driven by humans wanting to restore areas that they visit so that they're comfortable and safe in it. So I think there is a great opportunity for us to look at that, and with that type of education, thinking about these rights to nature, the human right to water, and combining that as a responsibility that everybody can enjoy. Miigwech.
Thank you. Cameron, it's your turn.
Thanks, Dave. Well, first, do the human rights to water and rights of nature, are they in conflict? Do they need to be in conflict? Well, they absolutely should not. As my panelists have said, we must not abstract ourselves from being in nature. Now, that is kind of an academic term, but what I mean by abstraction is we can't take ourselves out of nature. Like, yes, we are an influential species, and we can potentially be destructive, but we're also in nature. And when we take ourselves out of it, when we think of ourselves in this abstracted sense, I think it is quite dangerous, and it blinds us to how interconnected we are with each other as humans, but also with the non-anthropocentric world. How we are reliant on water cycles in the Earth system and on each other. But when, let's say, we endorse or privatization of water becomes very popular, in fact, our relationships with each other and the natural world itself, they really fray. And the focus is different. When we're thinking of being within nature and rights to nature intertwined with the human right to water, we can think of dignity, of upholding our capabilities, and community as well. I think there's a lot of momentum for, let's say, the human right to water, which is intertwined with human rights to water and nature. And I think a really interesting organization in the United States that's doing work on that, in addition to Flow, of course, is the Earth Law Center. I think they do a lot of good work on that. And I think we can also push back on possibly the intuition that these rights are in conflict. We instead must see the interconnection of human rights to both water and the rights of nature itself. I don't think we should even think that we should think that they need to be in conflict. That'll work against what we're trying to do together as a community.
Thank you. I would now like to bring this discussion back to the Great Lakes and the compact. As I mentioned, the compact has a general ban on diversions of water outside the watershed, which I think reflects a strong majority of citizens, views of a strong majority of citizens in the basin. But it does provide some limited exceptions. And one of those is an exception in the case of a humanitarian emergency. I was wondering if one of you could discuss what a humanitarian emergency would be in your eyes, and who would decide what that is. Is it a drought in the Midwest of the United States that threatens a major harvest of a crop and water is needed to replenish that? Is it a emergency somewhere in the world where drinking water is needed to save people's lives? And when we talk about water sharing, what does that really mean? I wonder if one of you could take that on.
When I think of water crises, when I think of influential academics who have inspired my own research, they speak about really we're fortunate to have an abundance of fresh water in the Great Lakes. We're very lucky in that sense. Now, we might also think of questions of, are we able to hold on to this water if others are in crisis? Can we potentially, let's say, even in a democratic sense, come to quote unquote hoard water? What if other populations need this water? Is it just or unjust is it just to withhold water in this sense? These are some of the questions that I've tried to tackle in my own research and in my doctoral research specifically. And the answer that I have grown towards, and that I think is the just answer, is that it would be unjust to withhold water. Of course, we need this to survive. But the caveat I want to put in this is we can't continue to make mistakes with our governance models. We can't continue to, let's say, divert water from the Great Lakes to communities in need for it to only be privatized, let's say, or to be used in inequitable ways, or to be wasted, for lack of a better term. I guess, what I'm trying to point to, and I think my panelists too, are we need to dig deeper than the surface level. Yes, there might be a water crisis somewhere due to drought, but what systems have we influenced to get to drought? Was that through our socioeconomic systems, and how have we been inefficient in our use inequitably? And before I just move on, I'll finish up right now with pointing back to democratic processes. Like, what do the majority or the stakeholders involved in this water sharing, what do they think? And how might we be able to not only uphold democracy in that specific locale, but really this is an active, larger democracy that we need to think about beyond just where water is. Yeah.
I want to follow up on that just a bit. Do you have any thoughts about the definition of humanitarian itself? What does that mean to you?
Well, when I think of intuitively the word humanitarian, I'm thinking of how to help our fellow people. But I think we need to also think beyond anthropocentrism. We need to think of other species that rely on water systems and nature at large. We can't just merely think of crises that have been created by us, for instance, but we need to think of a greater picture of rights and humanitarianism, moving it away from those processes that might have led us to a crisis to begin. So I think overall, I want us to broaden our scope of what humanitarianism may be.
Yes, thank you, Cameron, for sharing that. The elders have said that the next world war is going to be over blue gold. And when we think about blue gold, we think about the waters. And we see the waters moving in terms of They're flooding in places where they never flooded before. There's drought in places where there wasn't drought before. And what is the cause of this happening? And those causes relate back to humans, right? But I also think about simple little things. We look at both in the United States and Canada, clean, fresh drinking water flushes our toilets. When so many people don't even not have access to it to drink, and we are using it to flush our toilets. And I think, you know, we're in the year 2025, and my goodness, there's got to be some brilliant engineers out there that can come up with something that's acceptable by us as humans so that we're not wasting as much. I was in Washington and I was just amazed at how many people were washing the streets, and that's all clean drinking water, and they're washing the sidewalks and everything. Just, you know, I didn't see any sand or grease or anything else. So when I think about the waste, and when we think about the industries that use the water for whatever processes they may be doing, but not returning it back to its natural state, I think this is a time where we as humans have the technology and can enforce that type of technology to be happening so that we don't have to deal with so many diversions of water. Because when I think about that word humanitarian, I'm trying to think about that word from an Anishinaabe lens. And from the teachings that I have received, this is about being a good human. It is about being a responsible human, looking at what are your special gifts, your skill set, and how do you use that skill set to contribute to the collective continuance of life, not just the collective continuance of humanity, but the collective continuance of life. So this actually means living and being responsible to all life. And when we talk about that responsibility, it just resorts right back to the harmony and the balance and that respectfulness. So I think about how we have the technology, we have the knowledge, we just need to bring the people to the table. And when I say bringing the people to the table, I forget who the scholar was that said, when we look at a lot of these decision-making tables, there is a lack of women there. And I'm by no means a feminist, but I think about balance, and there's a lack of females at these decision-making tables. And there was a scholar who said, can you imagine when we don't invite women to the table, we're losing half of the world's brain power. So I think that these diversions are going to happen, and I challenge us to move beyond democracy and into consensus, unity, and having that compassion for other humans on what their needs are. But when I look at the United States and Canada and all of the supposedly first world countries, I think about the amount that we waste and what actually are our needs and not what our wants are. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thanks, Susan. We're starting to get some interesting questions here, but before we get into those, I just wanted to say that probably we're in a very divided political climate today. But one of the few issues that seems to unite people in the Great Lakes region is keep our water here, don't let it go elsewhere. Don't let it be exported to other parts of the US and Canada or other parts of the world. So that's the context for this discussion. And I'm seeing some questions that relate to that. One says, do you see the concept of the human right to water being used to divert water to areas that were overdeveloped by humans for what the land and aquifers could support? For instance, the suburbanization of the desert Southwest. And then another question is, should we not include Lake Baikal and other massive bodies of fresh water in the conversation when we speculate about addressing humanitarian crisis situations on a global scale? I don't know if any of you want to answer that or just offer some viewpoints on that.
I'll just quickly jump in on that first question of, could we see the human right to water used as the lens to divert water to the Southwest, or like let's even say to private companies, or to use it in a way to speak to thriving communities that are in the middle of the desert, let's just say hypothetically. I mean, of course, the human right to water can be used or abused in that way. As we've said earlier, it doesn't preclude inefficient or undemocratic or pro-privatization means, which is why I think we have to expand our scope of what that human right means and how we can decenter it from just people or just industry or what we even define as progress to be, in the sense that has led to inefficient use.
I think that it's right, as already has been stated, and I also touched on, right, that the language of rights, it can be used in different ways, and it could certainly be used in an extractive way. But I think if we're centering the idea that water is something that all life, including human life, needs to exist, and that's what's driving decisions versus, right, one entity, one corporation gaining profit off of it, I think, you know, being clear and kind of centering that distinction is very important, because often what happens, and we see this also in a lot of discussions around climate change, which is going to have a lot of implications for access to, right, clean, fresh water, that the problem is humans crossing borders, human migration, right? And then the rhetoric, it gets very politicized, and that political rhetoric is putting blame on the individuals who absolutely did the least to cause the situation we're in. So I think continuing to remember that ultimately at the end of the day, most of humans on this planet, right, we're all just trying to kind of exist and survive and hopefully work together to create a better world, and keeping that in mind versus, right, the few actors who are trying to kind of profit off of crises or disaster. And inherently these conversations are political, right? And so how do we come together collectively and as communities to create the sort of world that we want to see, right? I'll leave it at that.
Let's talk a little bit about commodification. One of the concerns that Flo has had about the compact is that it distinguishes between shipments of water out of the Great Lakes Basin in large containers and in small containers. Large containers are considered a diversion, small containers are not. And I guess I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about that issue and the issue of the compact treating water as a product as not subject to a diversion ban. So in other words, if water is removed through a human or mechanical process and put in bottles and shipped out of the basin, that's not a diversion. So when I think about those questions, I want to ask you, each of you, if you have a chance to, or thoughts on that, to discuss what commodification means to you and what threats it might have to sensitive ecosystems. One of the comments I get frequently when I discuss this in public is that, what's the difference between water in beer and water in bottles by itself? Maybe you can address one or more of those questions.
So, I mean, I think that, right, when I think a lot of the themes we're talking about here connect back to privatization in the sense of who has access to the water or not. So we see kind of globally that there has been kind of a push to privatize water, that it hasn't worked out, thinking about like municipal, like the water you turn on the tap and drink, and people coming together and resisting that. But privatization of drinking water, there's other pieces to it, right? It's bottled water as well. It's soft drinks and beer that require require water to make it. Construction of hydro dams, and all of these things can constitute what we call water grabbing. And really simply put, water grabbing is just kind of the appropriation or taking of water by financial capital. And I would argue doing that in a way that's placing profit over life. And we can see the privatization of drinking water and sanitation, the kind of process of bottled water, water needed for industry, for mining, water needed for kind of large scale monoculture, export agriculture, large dam constructions, and then financialization of water. These are all 6 different forms of water grabbing, according to Andreas Bieler, who's a scholar that works on the topic of water privatization and commodification. And this financialization of water is really, I think we can call it almost the privatization of life, because it's turning this thing that's necessary for life for all of us into something that we're just speculating, right? It's just a commodity for speculation, and it's increasingly driving all these different forms. And so I think that I can't speak to the particulars necessarily about the classification of small versus large containers, but I do think that there's a connection here to thinking about, for example, Nestle, right, who's polluting and taking and depleting water aquifers around the globe from Michigan to California to Nigeria. And they recently, in 2021, were acquired by One Rock Capital, which is a private equity firm. And so it makes it really harder to kind of target or know what's happening or where the water grabbing is happening, because now it's not just one company you can name and target. And so I think we need to really be paying attention to this and paying attention to how water is being appropriated and how water grabbing is operating, because on the one hand, just as however we want to put it, the powers that be, but financial capital, large corporations are kind of organized and working globally. But we as the people can be doing that and are doing that and need to be doing that as well, in order to, I think, center right life, human and other than human, and protecting our waters versus kind of that being led by like interests that only see, profit as their main guiding.
All right, thanks. Cameron, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, when I think in the Dr. Schroering speaks of different types of privatization. When I think of water grabbing or privatization at the government level, whether it's municipal or a statewide level, like put aside the ethical considerations. If we're thinking of it in consequential terms, like what are the consequences of it? We can see that privatization doesn't work out really, unless you already hold much capital, you're invested in it. And I'm not saying a small amount, like you are already capitalized, you will suffer. We can look to the famous example of England and Wales. They privatized their water system in the late 80s. And since then, water bills have increased 40% above inflation since 1989. And Thames Water, which is the large corporation that is responsible for privatization, is $18 billion in debt, and water quality has dropped. And really, we can look at privatization of municipal or statewide systems at that level with similar rates of failure. But if we're not thinking only in consequentialist terms, if we're thinking in moral terms or also in political angle, I think privatization makes governments lazy. Like governments can offshore or they can shirk away the responsibility that they have, that our elected officials have, to provide citizens with clean, fresh water, and foist it onto private actors, and then kind of wipe their hands clean of that responsibility. But yes, not only is that lazy, that's dangerous. That's dangerous for democracy. To use the term I was using earlier, it abstracts us from where we get our water, how we know it becomes potable or consumable. Really, where is it going? And that knowledge gap is filled by private actors. It's filled by capital. And that's to the detriment of community autonomy.
I just think that we need to understand that water is not finite. When we talk about the fresh water in the Great Lakes system, it's the largest body. Yes, it is, but it takes so long for it to go through the cycle and go back through the earth and come back up into where humans can see it and use it. And I think that we need to understand that it doesn't within this bubble, this ozone layer that we live in, water doesn't go anywhere, and it has never gone anywhere. So when we think about privatization, and we're privatizing one lake, and say it is Lake Erie, for instance, thinking about that interconnection that lake has with all of the other lakes, with the ground system, with the sky world waters, and how we need to understand that whole interconnectivity. And even when we look at the Great Lakes, we're looking at the surface only. We're not looking at what is underneath the actual ground and how that contributes to what we actually see. So I think when we think about privatization, we really need to understand and look at a bigger and broader picture.
Thank you. One of the questions that relates to this from the audience has to do with planning ahead. The question or the statement is water crisis, in my mind, assumes a catastrophic event which demands an immediate humanitarian response. To get Great Lakes water to a crisis region assumes the pre-catastrophic event investment in water withdrawal infrastructure. Should the Great Lakes region be making this sort of investment now, anticipating the likelihood of crisis in the future? In other words, should we have an anticipatory policy of being ready to share water?
Well, for sure, we have to utilize foresight when planning for the coming decades of more drought, or should I say more water extremes, of flooding in some regions and extreme drought in others, and how that will affect distribution of water, but also security. And that security within the United States, but also transboundary between Canada and the US. But something I just want to quickly push against is the inevitability of conflict. I think we can reorient ourselves to look at water cooperation as imperfect, but having worked quite well between the United States and Canada, with an over centuries old IJC, with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement being over 50 years old, and nigh on miraculous peace around freshwater resources. Like, of course, we are far, far from a just, equitable distribution of water resources in both Canada and the United States. But I hesitate to say that conflict is inevitable. And I think we can lean on community aspects of water, how communities get together to discuss the resources. Really looking at, if we want to tie this back into human rights as instantiated from below, as opposed to from on high, and look at how strong that is as a binder for community or cooperation. So although conflict might seem likely, and really climate change is going to do a number on us, so to speak, and it's going to affect how we get along, we need to also look at our history and what we have shared, and build on, let's say, ideas of trust, cooperation around water as that nucleus of trust and cooperation. And not to get too academic, there's a lot of research that's coming out of the Netherlands and Belgium, and really some of the work that was being done at United Nations University on water as a tool for peace. I think that's really interesting avenue if anyone's interested in. Thanks.
Thank you. A question about rights has come up, and that is, do people who choose to live where there is limited water have a right to divert fresh water from other sources, such as the Great Lakes? If there is a human right to water, does that override ecological integrity of the Great Lakes, or the wishes of people in the Great Lakes region? Should there be a right to move water to where people are and where they need it?
I don't necessarily know if people always choose to live in a desert region. We can take example, the casino place. I'm just evading my mind right now. But a whole entire city of casinos were built in the desert. And thinking about people needing to make a livelihood and moving in there. So I think more about the industrial activities that are happening. And if those industrial activities, they are not coming up with solutions on how to save water for the people that live in and around these regions that have gone there for employment, then I think that those industrial organizations are the ones that should have to pay for it. And I don't think that, we look around right now, and the whole entire system of the Great Lakes is changing. We have species that are here that weren't here before, that are a lot of species are here that weren't here before, but thinking about Phragmites and loofstreef and the zebra mussel and all these different species that are now coming in. And what are their roles and responsibilities, and what they're doing, and what are they changing, and how are things being affected by that? And I think that this long-term planning can really help address that. We can easily look at how much water we've used in the last 100 years just out of the Great Lakes, and forecast where we're going in the next 50, 10, 50, 100 years. And I think that we really need to have that foresight to be able to address these types of problems. But I also think that we need to bring all of those knowledge systems to the table in order to do that. It can't just be based on Western science.
Yeah, and I think it kind of connects to the previous question, right? So I would say, like, I think that we can't just be reacting to catastrophe, right? We do need to be proactive and coming together to imagine, and then to create kind of new ways of how we're living with each other and other than human life. I think, I can speak, and maybe in another question, to kind of the power I have seen for change of organized communities coming together around issues connected to water and holding governments and corporations accountable to do what's right. And I think there is a lot of hope in that and examples of hope in that, just as there's still a lot of work to be done. But I very much agree with what was just stated about, people don't always choose where they live. So should we be creating, I don't know, brand new developments of $500,000 or more, homes in the desert? I'm going to say no, we probably shouldn't be doing that. But I also think that this question of scarcity, and it isn't to say that some regions don't have very little water and others have a lot. Of course, that is real. But I also very strongly see that often, especially around environmental issues, we frame it as one of scarcity. And the problem isn't one of scarcity, right? The problem isn't that someone else is taking your water or someone's taking a 20-minute shower instead of a 5-minute one. That is not the root of the problem. The root of the problem is social and economic structures we have created that are not to the benefit for the vast majority of us, right? And so I think keeping that in mind and trying to approach it not from a mindset of, oh my gosh, you're going to take the water from me, when the problem actually isn't all of us, ordinary people. It's in many cases governments who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing and working in collusion with corporations to say, well, how much can we extract and take and gain as much profit off of this as possible, without thinking about what that's going to mean for people today and future generations.
On foresight and planning ahead, if we collectively, as the state decision makers, adhere to the status quo, then there will be no long-term planning. Our socioeconomic structure is one that focuses on quarters, not on stewardship, not on looking decades ahead, but instead it's quite myopic. So really, what we all want, like what I want to point to, and I think my panelists too, these are structural issues. We can't merely point to individuals as this is the problem of someone who moved to Phoenix. No, this is an issue of capital, of our structures themselves that we have to reflect on, deliberate on, and change actively.
Just want to alert the audience and the panelists, we have about 10 more minutes for this discussion before I turn it back to Liz. If anybody want to take on this issue that seems to bother a lot of people, what's the difference between water as a product and water in a product? Water that's used to make something else, such as beverages, or used in the manufacture of other products, and water in its natural state being converted and sold. Is there a difference legally, morally, or otherwise?
Water in a product versus water as a product is directly related to water usage. And no matter if it's all being taken out of the Great Lakes, if it's being sold beyond this water basin, then what are the water usage licenses associated with that? And I don't know if our water usage licenses are actually fair, because I'm not a legal person and I haven't looked at that, but that's what I think about right away is these water usages. And even industries that are nuclear power, for example, uses a lot of water to keep the reactors cool, and they have a water usage license. So if we take a look at what these water usage licenses are actually doing, or if somebody may be already doing this, I don't know, but I think that understanding that and addressing that in a more holistic fashion is based on amount being taken, as opposed to what it's actually being used for. And if we look at the amounts being taken and try to determine what is the fairest way to address that, as opposed to water as a product or water in a product.
There are different forms of expropriation, extraction of water, but is there a different moral calculus attached to, let's say, bottled water as opposed to another sort of extractive industry? I hesitate to say so. We not to be too much of a universalizable principle, but and to belabor the point on politics being in mind when we think of extraction, but we have to look at different circumstances when bottled water might be needed. This is to say not that I'm endorsing bottled water, but sometimes bottled water is the only way a community can get clean, fresh water itself. So we must not in that sense put a moral calculus onto it, but again, look at what systems have allowed for this community to be without potable water, without clean, fresh water. So I think we have to again expand our notions of injustice and again what the human right to water or rights of nature might allow to change circumstances too.
Seeing a lot of questions about the participation in a process related to decision making about water being taken out of the Great Lakes for a humanitarian purpose, emergency. Do any of you have thoughts about who ought to be at the table and what criteria should be used to make that decision if it does come to that?
When it comes who should be at the table, I think there needs to be a representative of people that are living in the Great Lakes. It can't just be government making decisions for us, because I think we are starting to realize that these decisions aren't always in the best interest of the people and of the Great Lakes. So I think everybody, there needs to be an equitable share of people at the table making these decisions, and which includes women and people of color. And in terms of what the criteria needs to be, I think it may fluctuate depending on what the situation is, because we look at some of these war-torn zones and people being forced out of those areas and into different types of camps that don't have access to the water. Who's responsible for that? How do we address that? So I think that the criteria can be developed with, say, a table of experts and representing industry, the public, and all peoples, and developing that criteria, but making sure that the development of that criteria is very transparent and that it is taken to community town hall conversations so that everybody can have some input on what that criteria might look like. I don't think that, if I made the criteria, then it might be a little bit different, but if we bring all of these minds together. So I think that being able to have the voice, and if people don't understand why a certain criteria is being there, we need to sit at the table and have the lengthy conversation so that we can come to an agreement. And we can even agree to disagree, but we're still agreeing. So I think that, in my mind, that's what a process should look like in terms of deciding on a difficult situation like that.
Would it be fair to say that all three of you would agree that we need to consider these issues preventively in the short term as opposed to waiting until a crisis is upon us?
As Dr. Schroering said earlier, we have to be proactive instead of reactive. Once we react to these issues, it's kind of too late. We must plan already for not only potential conflicts, but whatever water injustices might arise, or and be vigilant against privatization.
Are there any examples anywhere in the world that where this has been an issue that we could learn from? Anything parallel to this in terms of water being shipped, removed for humanitarian emergency? This is purely speculative.
Yeah, I was thinking that humanitarian purposes for people in war zones, water being shipped to them. Where it comes from, I'm not exactly sure. Thinking about those types of situations, and then even within Canada, water is shipped into remote First Nation communities because they do not have access to clean drinking water. So these types of things are happening. It's maybe just not at the scale that we're recognizing, or that the media is covering, so that we're not aware of it.
All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, I mean, I think, is there an exact kind of example that I know of completely similar? No, but I think, right, even thinking about bottled water and how bottled water gets shipped, bottled water sent to Flint, Michigan, and there is a place for that. Sometimes bottled water is what we need for an emergency, but I think to me, it's actually, thinking about bottled water as a form of water grabbing, and that usually, right, these companies are extracting it, they're paying very little or nothing, or even using tap water, and then that's being repurposed and being used is kind of an example of why we have to think we're already in many crises, right? So, but how do we come together proactively to keep it from getting worse and to think through these things and plan for the future, I think, is really critical. And thinking about who's going to be making those decisions and who's going to be profiting off of crises, and trying to make it so that, right, people can't profit off of it. And I'm giving bottled water as one example, I think is really key. And we often don't think about bottled water from that kind of perspective, but I think it is, yeah, that gets shipped around, right, for people, sometimes as a luxury, but sometimes as a need. But it is a form of water grabbing and moving water from one place to another that also creates a ton of plastic waste. So I think we could think through some similarities there.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. We're pretty much at the end of our time. I wanted to thank Caitlin and Cameron and Susan for your expertise and your thoughts today. I really appreciate it. And I just want to remind people that we do have a report on some of these issues that has come out today from Flow. You'll find it on our website. And thanks again. Liz, I'll turn it back to you.
Wow, what an incredible conversation. I am inspired and want to thank all of our panelists for such a robust conversation, wonderful moderation, as always, Dave, and a huge thanks to our attendees. You have just asked incredibly important questions about the future of water, and being in such a water-rich region. These are the questions that we must ask ourselves, and I especially appreciate all of the thoughtful answers of how important it is to reflect on our history of collaboration and cooperation, and to use that to help us plan for the future. That is how we can really shift the paradigms that you have all spoken about. I'd like to also give special thanks to Barton J. Ingram and Gail G. Ingram Foundation for making this webinar possible. Thank you so much. And lastly, I just want to reflect for a moment, because we had over 550 people register for this webinar, really illustrating the great interest on this subject. And we know that countless others are going to watch it on demand over the next coming weeks and months. Your voices matter in this fight to protect the Great Lakes, and I hope that you have also come away from this event today feeling more knowledgeable. Finally, we'll encourage you to visit forloveofwater.org to download, read, and share our report, A Watershed Moment, the Great Lakes Compact after 15 years. Thank you to all of you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.